The morning sun crept lazily over the hills, casting a golden glow on the rolling acres of Elijah Boone's property. Nestled at the edge of Willow Creek, his family's 150-year-old farm stood proud, a weathered red barn at its heart, its faded paint and sturdy beams telling stories older than the town itself. Life moved at its own pace here. Chickens clucked in the yard, the old windmill creaked, and Elijah, gruff but kind, with calloused hands and a coffee mug permanently fused to one, spent his days tending crops and feeding livestock. Peaceful, steady, and simple, just how he liked it. That peace, however, was about to get bulldozed by a manicured smile and a clipboard. Her name was Janet Cartwright, though everyone whispered the same two words when she strolled into a room. Hoa Karen. She'd recently moved into the brand-new luxury subdivision sprouting like a weed on the edge of Elijah's farmland, rows of identical beige houses, each with a mandatory mailbox design and grass trimmed to military precision. Her kingdom of control had expanded, and now her eyes were on the land next door. Elijah first saw her marching down his gravel driveway in designer heels, stepping gingerly around a cow patty like it was a landmine. He was halfway through nailing a board to the fence when her voice chirped. "Excuse me, sir." "Yes, you, hello." He turned, wiping sweat off his brow, already suspicious of anyone using that much perfume this close to a chicken coop. "I'm Janet Cartwright, president of the Willow Heights HOA, she announced, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm here on behalf of several neighbors who have raised concerns about the visual impact of your barn." Elijah blinked. Visual impact. "Yes, the color is outdated, to put it kindly. It doesn't align with our community's aesthetic standards. We'd like you to repaint it, something neutral, maybe a soft eggshell or beige." He stared, unsure if she was joking. "Ma'am, that barn been red since my great-granddaddy built it. It's older than your whole subdivision." Janet sniffed. "Precisely. It sticks out. Think of property values. Consistency is key. I've brought a few approved swatches." "Swatches?" Elijah interrupted, dumbfounded. Janet held up a fan of tiny pastel rectangles like she was offering a religious pamphlet. "This one's called Whispering Cream. Isn't it calming?" He didn't answer, just watched her pivot and walk back up the driveway, heels clicking like a metronome of doom. Elijah looked up at the barn, its proud red boards glowing in the sun. His jaw tightened. Something told him this woman was just getting started. 2 days later, Elijah returned from town to find a crisp white envelope duct-taped to his barn door. The paper bore the emblem of the Willow Heights Homeowners Association and the unmistakable scent of perfume, likely the same floral assault Janet wore like armor. He peeled it off and unfolded the letter, scanning the paragraphs typed in Times New Roman and dripping with polite aggression. "Dear Mr. Boone, per HOA Regulation 462 regarding visual harmony across adjoining properties, you are hereby requested to repaint your barn within 14 days of receipt of this notice. Failure to comply may result in fines or further action." Elijah snorted. "Further action," he muttered. He wasn't part of any HOA. His property had been in his family since before Willow Heights was a twinkle in a developer's eye. What jurisdiction did they think they had? He crumpled the letter and tossed it into the feed bucket. That evening he got a call from his cousin who worked at the post office. "Lidge, you might want to check out the town Facebook page," she said. "Karen, Janet is stirring the pot." Elijah raised an eyebrow, grabbed his old iPad, and pulled up the town's community group. Sure enough, there she was in full digital glory. "Does anyone else think that red barn ruins the look of our beautiful neighborhood?" her post began. "We work so hard to maintain standards, and then this is what our guests see when they drive in. Can't we do better?" The comments were a mix, some agreeing with her, many defending Elijah, and a few just there for the drama. But one thing was clear. Karen had declared war, and she wasn't fighting fair. She'd even posted a photo of the barn, zoomed in, angled to make it look dilapidated, which was ironic, considering it had just had new shingles and a fresh coat of linseed oil. Elijah leaned back in his chair and sighed. "She really thinks she can push me around," he said to his dog, Rusty, who gave a low grumble of agreement. The next day, another notice arrived, this time certified. The envelope was thicker, containing documentation of the barn's alleged violations and 3 recommended paint contractors approved by the HOA. One even offered a rustic neutrals package, which nearly made Elijah spit his coffee in disbelief. Beige. They wanted to beige his barn. By the weekend, Janet had escalated to drop-in visits. She'd appear without warning, clipboard in hand, snapping photos and muttering about code compliance and community cohesion. At one point, she measured the distance between the barn and her subdivision fence, then scribbled something furiously in her notes. When Elijah finally confronted her, she smiled like he was a child who just didn't understand the rules. "It's nothing personal," she chirped. "We're just trying to create a pleasant, uniform atmosphere. I'm sure you'll come around. Most people do, eventually." Elijah stared at her, calm and quiet. But behind his eyes, a storm was brewing. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just picked the wrong barn to mess with. The following week brought no peace. Janet's crusade against Elijah's barn intensified like a second job she wasn't being paid for, but thoroughly enjoyed. Every morning, Elijah spotted her standing just outside her property line, snapping photos like she was building a case for a true crime documentary. Sometimes she had backup, neighbors in yoga pants and golf carts, nodding solemnly as she pointed at the barn like it was a crime scene. She wasn't subtle either. One morning, Elijah caught her loudly describing the barn to her husband over speakerphone. "It's honestly offensive," she said, as if it were painted in neon flames. "A violent splash of red. It undermines everything we've built here." Elijah stayed composed, but inside he was seething. She had now filed a complaint with the local zoning board, citing aesthetic disruption. The nerve of it all, her new neighborhood didn't even exist on local maps 5 years ago, and now she was treating his heritage like it was graffiti on a mall wall. Things took a turn for the absurd when a local real estate agent dropped by. "Hi, so sorry to bother you," she chirped. "Janet said you might be interested in a barn makeover to help elevate community property values. We offer a discount on curb-cohesive facelifts." Elijah nearly choked on his iced tea. Curb-cohesive. Yes, imagine it. A softer beige, maybe add a faux shutter here and there. Make it Instagrammable. She beamed, completely unaware of the fire she was playing with. He politely escorted her off the land, then retreated inside and locked the door. The disrespect was starting to feel personal, and worse, relentless. By midweek, flyers began appearing in Elijah's mailbox. "Preserve property values, repaint the red menace," they read, complete with photoshopped mock-ups of the barn in gentle cream and pine mist. Elijah didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Rusty barked at the flyer like even the dog had had enough. Then came the final straw. Elijah returned from a supply run to find a contractor's truck idling in his drive. 2 men were unloading paint cans. "Afternoon, HOA hired us to do a consult and color test," one said, motioning toward the barn. "We'll just be a sec, got some eggshell we want to sample." Elijah's voice was low but firm. "Put those cans back in the truck, now." The men hesitated, caught between a clipboard and a cowboy. "We were told." "You were told wrong," Elijah snapped, stepping between them and the barn like a guard dog. "You so much as touch one board and I'm calling the sheriff." They left without another word. That night, Elijah sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The barn glowed softly in the twilight. His fingers drummed on the armrest. Karen had gone too far. She thought this was just about paint. But she didn't understand what that barn was or what it represented. Elijah wasn't the type to start a fight, but he sure knew how to end one. That night, he dug through the old trunk in his attic, kicking up dust and memories. Inside were weathered manila folders, yellowed photographs, and a leather-bound binder held together with twine. He hadn't opened it in years. It was his grandfather's historical preservation file, a meticulously compiled record of the farm's legacy. His fingers moved slowly, reverently, flipping through land grants, newspaper clippings, and the golden ticket he knew had to be there. There it was, a formal certificate from the State Historical Society, embossed and signed in 1987, officially declaring the Boone Barn a registered historical landmark. He chuckled quietly. "You done picked a fight with the wrong piece of history, Karen." The barn had been recognized not just for its age, but its architectural rarity. It was one of the last standing hand-pegged Dutch gable barns in the region, built with timber harvested from the same land it stood on. Schoolchildren had taken field trips here. There were even 2 feature articles in old farming magazines. His grandfather had spent years fighting for its recognition. And now a bored suburban general with a beige agenda thought she could paint over all that with whispering cream. Elijah scanned the documents, snapping high-quality photos. Then he called his friend Nadine down at the county registrar's office. "Nadine, I need a certified copy of a preservation file. You still got those connections in the historical council." Nadine's voice perked up. "You finally going to use it, huh? Thought you—" "Never ask. That lady's been poking the wrong bear." Next, he drafted a letter, not an angry rant, but a formal notice, dripping with legal charm. He attached the scanned documentation and emailed it directly to the Willow Heights HOA board with the subject line, "Cease and desist. Violation of historic preservation rights." He made sure to CC the county clerk, the local historical society, and just for fun, the local newspaper. Then he started printing. Flyers, dozens of them. He put up posters at the general store, post office, and church bulletin board. Come visit the historic Boone Barn, a registered landmark since 1987. Free tour every Saturday. Photography welcome. Preservation appreciated. He updated the barn's page on the town website. Heck, he even made a Facebook post complete with a side-by-side photo of the barn and a smug-looking Janet holding up a paint swatch with the caption, "History or HOA? You decide." By the next morning, his inbox was buzzing with messages of support. Old friends, history buffs, even a local TV station reached out, wanting to do a feature. Elijah leaned back in his chair, savoring the quiet before the storm. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't threatening. He was preparing the perfect counterstrike, calm as ever. And Karen? Karen had no clue she'd just been outmaneuvered by a farmer with a historical landmark and a whole town behind him. Elijah woke up the next morning to the sweet sound of justice brewing, birds chirping, the rooster crowing, and Rusty wagging his tail excitedly as if he, too, sensed that something glorious was about to unfold. The plan was already in motion. All he had to do now was nudge it forward, one delicious step at a time. He started by officially registering for the town's annual Heritage Days festival, a low-key event usually reserved for old storefronts and Civil War reenactments. This year, however, Elijah's barn would be the main attraction. He added a fresh banner to the front gate. Boone Family Barn, celebrating 150 years of history, followed by, as seen in American Farmstead Magazine, 1993 edition. He didn't even need to make that up. It was framed and still hanging in the kitchen. Then came the flyers, bright red ones this time, complete with a sepia-toned photo of the barn and the caption, "This is what history looks like. Come see what HOA Karens want to paint over." He dropped one in every mailbox around Willow Heights. He also made sure to leave a stack right at the community center, and another inside the HOA's own clubhouse. Each flyer included a QR code that linked to a short, heartstring-tugging video of Elijah talking about his grandfather, the barn's legacy, and how it was protected under historical preservation law. The video ended with a line that hit home. "This barn doesn't just belong to me, it belongs to our town's story." While that simmered, Elijah gave a quiet heads-up to the local paper's editor, a high school buddy of his. They loved a good local scandal, especially one with a villain as juicy as Janet Cartwright. Within 24 hours, the newspaper ran a headline in bold above the fold. HOA versus History, the Battle of Boone Barn. Janet's name was front and center, along with a photo of her standing in front of the barn mid-lecture, arm extended like she was commanding troops. It was perfect. The final touch, Elijah invited a local fourth-grade class to come to the barn that Friday. He greeted them in a pair of overalls, with lemonade, animal crackers, and a story about the barn's construction. He even let them paint little wooden models of red barns to take home. And right on schedule, Janet showed up. She froze when she saw the kids, the banner, the historical landmark, sign now mounted permanently on the barn wall, and the news crew setting up nearby. "Oh," she said, eyes narrowing. "So this is what you've been up to." Elijah smiled as he handed a wooden barn to a giggling child. "Just teaching folks about a little history," he said, casually handing the reporter another document. "You know, something worth preserving." The trap had been set, public opinion had turned. The legal backup was in place, the media was watching. And Karen? She was standing right in the middle of it, her clipboard useless and her controls slipping through her manicured fingers. The big moment came faster than Elijah expected. By Saturday morning, the barn had become a minor tourist attraction. Cars lined the gravel road, kids posed for photos with Rusty, and an elderly historian in a tweed jacket gave impromptu lectures about rural craftsmanship and the symbolic endurance of agrarian America. It was glorious chaos, and every bit of it legally sanctioned. Meanwhile, Janet's HOA kingdom was crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. The HOA board had received a formal letter from the county's Historical Preservation Office outlining in no uncertain terms that any attempt to alter, paint, or modernize the Boone Barn would not only violate state preservation laws, but could result in criminal fines. The letter was signed, stamped, and best of all, publicly posted on the town hall's bulletin board. Elijah made sure a copy was taped to his mailbox, right where Janet could see it. She arrived shortly after, dressed for battle in khaki slacks, oversized sunglasses, and her ever-present clipboard. She tried to march up to the barn as she always had, but this time a county historical rep intercepted her. "Ms. Cartwright," he said, calm but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This structure is protected. Any further harassment could be considered interference with a state landmark." Janet's face tightened. "This is absurd. It's just a barn." "No," Elijah said, stepping forward, his voice carrying just the right amount of southern steel. "It's the barn, and you've been barking up the wrong hayloft." The crowd, sensing drama, began to gather. Phones came out. Even the local TV crew, who had come for a heartwarming story, sensed the shift and started recording. Janet sputtered, trying to reclaim her footing. "This isn't about history, it's about aesthetics. This building, this thing, lowers our community standards." Elijah smiled. "Funny thing about history, Janet, it doesn't give a damn about your standards." The historical rep handed her a packet of regulations and turned to the camera crew. "We're proud to have landmarks like the Boone Barn. They remind us that progress doesn't always mean painting over the past." Janet's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for relevance. Then, in a move that would later be immortalized in memes, she snatched a paint swatch from her clipboard and dramatically tossed it on the ground. "Fine," she shrieked. "Enjoy your barn." The crowd burst into cheers, some even applauding. One of the schoolchildren whispered loudly, "She's like a cartoon villain," which sent a ripple of laughter through the group. Elijah tipped his hat, nodded to the reporters, and walked back into the barn like a sheriff after a successful standoff. The battle was over, and beige had lost. Janet's meltdown became the stuff of local legend. Within hours of her dramatic paint swatch toss, clips of her outburst were circulating on social media, edited to slow motion with dramatic music and sarcastic subtitles. Karen versus the barn trended regionally. One particularly popular video cut between her angry declarations and footage of peaceful cows chewing cud, while the words "whispering cream has left the chat" flashed across the screen. Back in the quiet cul-de-sacs of Willow Heights, things were far less entertaining, for Janet at least. The HOA board, now realizing the legal quicksand she'd dragged them into, held an emergency meeting. Not only had she acted far beyond her authority, but she had also risked the entire HOA being sued by the state. They voted unanimously to remove her from her self-appointed throne. Her president title, gone. Her clipboard, confiscated. Her Facebook admin privileges, revoked with the kind of efficiency usually reserved for cyber attacks. Janet's public humiliation rippled through the neighborhood like a particularly satisfying soap opera twist. The same neighbors who once nodded solemnly behind her now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Someone even placed a tiny toy barn, painted fire truck red, on her front porch with a card that read, "In loving memory of your control issues." Meanwhile, Elijah was having the time of his life. Every time he stopped into town, folks shook his hand, offered to buy him a beer, or shared a new meme someone had made about the Beige Rebellion. His barn had never looked better, especially with the new official historical landmark plaque now proudly mounted beside the front door. At the Saturday farmers market, a local teen handed him a homemade t-shirt with a bold graphic, a cartoon barn flexing muscles, under the words, "Don't mess with red." Elijah laughed so hard he nearly dropped his tomatoes. Back in Willow Heights, Janet tried to spin the situation. She claimed she'd been passionately misunderstood and attempted to host a community cohesion circle. No one showed up, unless you counted the rubber chicken someone left on her lawn chair. Her reputation was toast. She'd become the very thing she feared most, inconsistent with the community aesthetic. Elijah, on the other hand, didn't gloat, not outwardly. He just went about his day, tipping his hat, waving to kids, and giving barn tour with the same calm pride his grandfather once had. But every now and then, when he passed Janet's house, he'd offer the slightest grin and say just loud enough, "Beige ain't a color, it's a surrender." And Corinne learned that day what happens when you try to fight history with a paint swatch and a bad attitude. Peace returned to the Boone farm like an old friend settling into a rocking chair. The barn, still red and radiant, stood tall against the spring sky, a proud survivor of one woman's ill-conceived war on heritage. Elijah leaned on the fence post with his coffee in hand, watching a new litter of kittens tumble in the hay while Rusty dozed lazily in a patch of sun. The birds sang, the windmill spun, and life returned to the rhythm it had always known, simple, steady, and stubbornly unpainted. Tour groups still came by on weekends. Parents took photos of their kids in front of the barn, and old-timers swapped stories about the days when Elijah's grandfather ran the place. Even a food truck started showing up during peak hours, selling Corinne's crumble apple pies and beige-free lemonade. Elijah didn't mind the attention. As long as the barn stayed red, the stories stayed alive. Meanwhile, Janet had gone suspiciously quiet. Rumor had it she took a sudden sabbatical from community life. Her yard, once trimmed with the precision of a golf course, began to grow wild around the edges. The HOA newsletters made no mention of her, as if she had been quietly edited out of the neighborhood's history. Some joked she'd gone underground to start a black market swatch club. Others swore she was spotted at a Sherwin-Williams whispering apologies to a display of red paints. But Elijah didn't hold a grudge. Not really. He just knew that sometimes the land teaches lessons better than people ever could. You don't mess with legacy, you don't paint over pride, and you sure don't tangle with a barn that's outlived more than a few people's entire belief systems. That afternoon, a school bus rolled up the hill and a dozen wide-eyed kids stepped out with notebooks and sketch pads. Their teacher waved to Elijah. "We're doing a project on local heroes," she said. "Hope you don't mind." He smiled, brushing some straw off his flannel. "Long as they don't bring paint, they're always welcome." As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in soft golds and deep reds, Elijah sat on his porch, sipping sweet tea and watching the barn glow like a memory refusing to fade. Legacy wasn't about buildings or boards or even battles. It was about standing firm when everything around you tried to change who you were. And sometimes, the best revenge wasn't shouting or suing. It was just keeping the damn barn red.